Automated Podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So over the past few years, there's been a growing discourse and debate surrounding food security and nutrient availability now and for the future. And as agricultural land is becoming less fertile, fresh water is becoming contaminated, and there's really a general mismanagement of the natural resources we depend on for a functioning food system, alternative solutions keep popping up to deal with the probable shortages that countries will experience. And these solutions take many forms. So whether that's going to be a locally sourced diet, this kind of eating only what is in season or coming from the surrounding range, typically around 100 kilometers or 100 miles, or plant-based diets, which use, of course, less water, space, and less monocrops, which predominantly go towards supporting the meat and dairy industry anyways, to the more technological and peripheral ideas out there, such as vertical farming or incorporating lab-grown meat, or even cultivating insect-based protein for animal as well as human consumption. So we have already seen, of course, a growth in both the locavore movement as well as the vegetarian and vegan movements over the past several years. I think this is pretty obvious for anybody that has been paying attention. And even though lab-grown meat has significantly dropped in price from its initial cost of well over $100,000 per hamburger patty, it is still more expensive than the standard meat options in the store, which is kind of one of the breaking points that's required for this technology to be taken up by most people at scale. However, insect production is already a valid approach, and even more so when an automated production process is incorporated, which we'll get into in a little bit. So today we'll be looking at this interesting and certainly different perspective of creating food security for our uncertain future. But to start off, let's look at what insect farming is in a nutshell. So today, already, it is thought that there's something around 1,900 varieties of insects that are already consumed worldwide. So the most popular insects by far are something called honey beetles and the more commonly known caterpillar, which make up between 31% and 18% of all insects consumed, respectively. Other somewhat popular contenders are wasps, grasshoppers, and crickets, ants, and locusts. So an estimated 150 to 200 species of edible insects are farmed and consumed in Southeast Asia alone. Thailand is a leader at insect farming with an estimated 20,000 food insect farms, mostly rearing crickets and palm weevils. And I'm sure that this number has grown substantially as these figures come from several years ago. But there are clear preferences when talking about insect cultivation for food concerns, specifically food. So beetles, caterpillars, and grasshoppers, and within that, crickets and locusts, are the main favorites due to their protein content, low resource needs, and fast-growing times. So on average, the protein content of edible insects ranges between 35 to 60% dry weight, which are actually higher than plant protein sources, including cereal, soybeans, and lentils. And at the upper range, insects provide more protein than even meat and chicken eggs. However, there is a catch to this. Insect protein digestibility is highly variable due to the presence of the hard exoskeletons. So some studies have found that insect protein digestibility can be as high as 77%, to 98%, but only after the exoskeleton has been removed. And this leads us to one of the main challenges for the industry, the need for automation. So most of the insect farms out there are still small-scale and speculative investments, especially when compared to the size of traditional industrial agriculture and the 30 billion or so per year farmed animals out there. There are commercially successful insect farms that use labor-intensive techniques. However, just like the current animal farming practices, and perhaps even more so, industrial scale insect farming really lends itself to serious limitations without fully automated systems in place. So if the environment, growing process, and harvesting time aren't properly controlled, issues like insect cannibalism, mold, and general contamination really risk stalling or even shutting down entire operations. This is not to mention the typical issue of human error that can, of course, interrupt the production process, harm insect batches, and generate all sorts of problems for a small or large-scale operation. As this is also still an emerging industry with numerous unknowns, I've read that at least one company had to be fully shut down due to the CEO actually developing a fatal and unknown and untreatable allergy to some part of the operation. I have an interesting article in the show notes, which was written by the CEO, which I think if any of you want to look into it a little bit further, is quite interesting. He was actually one of the CEOs, one of the companies that was actually automating a large percentage of the entire process, but because of this strange allergy that was developed over the couple of years that he was trying to build up the company, the whole thing had to be shut down for his health, unfortunately. So actually one of the more interesting and possibly problematic aspects that automation could solve has to do with a form of quality control that doesn't typically impact traditional animal farming. So to make insects into edible products, they are subjected to a range of different processes. Some like sun drying or freeze drying, grinding, defatting, acid hydrolysis, and a range of other processes that are out there. So each technique is likely to affect actually the biochemical composition of the insect biomass differently. So in a study, for example, of sun-dried edible black ants, out of the 28 organic components that were studied, 5 were lost, while 4 new were actually formed. So fatty acids, aldehyde, and alkalines appeared during the sun-drying phase. So this, coupled with the issue of the exoskeletons, which reduces the bioavailability of the insect protein, causes some potentially serious issues for insects to be used as human food. But in a controlled and automated environment, these issues can be precisely measured, adjusted for specific needs, and controlled for the optimal outcome. The problem, of course, is that a controlled environment and automated production process itself costs significantly more, especially when competing with an already highly subsidized industry such as industrialized agriculture, which already also has economies of scales kind of refined to an art in some of the practices that are employed. And that's why some are positing that insect food cultivation might make more sense for a more futuristic application than for the kind of common human food consumption. So insects have long been known to be able to reproduce inside of shuttles and enclosed stations in the zero-gravity environment of outer space, and can serve both as a source of protein and other nutrients, and as a tool for recycling materials and producing soil fertilizer. So Mars is the second target of manned spaceflight next to the Moon, and possibly the most distant extraterrestrial body to which we could travel and explore within the next half-century. Requirements and design of life support for a Mars mission are quite different from those being operated on near-Earth orbit or for a lunar mission, because of the long mission duration, some 2.5 years for a round trip. With insects as a protein source that can be cultivated on board a spaceship, as well as a station on Mars or another planet, they are the ideal food for astronauts. There was actually a trial that was held in a sealed laboratory in Beijing, China, and in the trial it found that 3 astronauts could subsist healthily and happily with mealworms as their staple protein source for 105 days in a simulation of a space mission conducted for research purposes. And this was back in 2015. So it is possible that part of the solution for feeding the explorers that venture into the final frontier might consist of different insect growing batches rather than just the pre-made meals and bars that are often depicted to us. Personally, I'm not sure if this makes space exploration more or less desirable, but it'll certainly be interesting to see if space industry jobs of the future will include automated insect growing technicians or some form of this. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.